The Daily Stoic by Ryan Holiday and Stephen Hanselman. Let's begin somewhere unexpected, not with a quote from Marcus Aurelius, not with a philosophical argument. Let's begin with a letter. Somewhere in the 2nd century of the Roman Empire, a man sat down and wrote to himself. Not to posterity, not for an audience, not to be published or preserved. He wrote private notes, reminders, rebukes, reflections that he apparently never intended anyone else to read. He was, at the time he wrote them, the most powerful person on earth. He commanded legions. He ruled an empire that stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia. He had more wealth, more authority, more human power at his disposal than almost any person in recorded history. And what did he write to himself? He wrote about how he was failing to live up to his own standards, how he was easily distracted, how he caught himself acting out of vanity, how he needed to remind himself, again and again, that death was coming and that time was not to be wasted, and that the only thing worth caring about was whether he was living virtuously right now. In this moment, not in some imagined future self-improvement. He wrote like a man trying, imperfectly and with constant slippage, to be better than his nature wanted him to be. His name was Marcus Aurelius. The notes he kept to himself were eventually compiled and published, centuries after his death, under the title Meditations. And they remain, 20 centuries later, one of the most widely read and deeply moving pieces of personal philosophy in human history. Why does this matter for a book published in 2016? Because the Daily Stoic, written by Ryan Holiday and translated by Stephen Hanselman, is built on the argument that the words Marcus Aurelius wrote to himself, and the words of Epictetus and Seneca and a dozen other Stoic thinkers stretching back to the school's founding in Athens around 300 BCE, are not museum pieces. They are not academic curiosities for philosophers with tenure. They are practical equipment for living a human life. And the human problems they address, the problem of anger, the problem of fear, the problem of desire, the problem of loss, the problem of other people, the problem of death, are exactly as present in the 21st century as they were in ancient Rome or Athens. Because human beings are exactly as present.
And human nature has not changed.
The Daily Stoic is organized as a year's worth of daily readings, one page for each of the 366 days of the calendar year, including leap day. Each day offers a single translated passage from one of the Stoic philosophers, followed by a short commentary by Holiday that connects the ancient thought to modern life. 12 months, 12 themes. January through April, the discipline of perception, learning to see clearly. May through August, the discipline of action, learning to act rightly. September through December, the discipline of will, learning to endure and accept what cannot be changed. But we're not going to walk through all 366 days here. What we're going to do is something different and more useful. We're going to walk through the entire architecture of Stoic thought that the book is built on, the history, the key philosophers, the major concepts, the 12 thematic pillars month by month, and then turn to a full and honest critical analysis of what the book does well, where it falls short, and what it means that this very ancient philosophy has become, in recent years, one of the most popular self-help frameworks in the Western world. This should take us about 90 minutes. Let's begin at the very beginning. Part 1. What is Stoicism? The philosophy itself. Stoicism was founded in Athens around 300 BCE by a man named Zeno of Citium. Zeno had been a merchant. On a voyage from Phoenicia to Piraeus, his ship was wrecked, and he lost everything: cargo, money, livelihood. He washed up in Athens with nothing and, according to the historical account, wandered into a bookshop and started reading about Socrates. He was so moved that he asked the bookseller where he could find men like Socrates. The bookseller pointed to a philosopher passing outside. Zeno followed him. And from that chance encounter, one of the most enduring schools of thought in Western history was born. The school was called Stoa, the painted porch, the public colonnade in Athens where Zeno first taught, which is where the name Stoicism comes from. From the beginning, it was unusual among ancient philosophical schools in one specific way. It was profoundly, deliberately practical. The Stoics were not interested in elaborate metaphysical systems or abstract theorizing for its own sake. They were interested in the question of how to live, how to face adversity, how to act rightly, how to maintain inner freedom in circumstances of outer constraint, how to be a good human being consistently, whether you are an emperor or a slave. And those two extremes, emperor and slave, are not rhetorical. The three philosophers at the center of the Daily Stoic represent, almost impossibly, exactly those two poles. Marcus Aurelius was the emperor of Rome from 161 to 180 CE, ruling the largest empire in the Western world at its height of power. He came to Stoicism through his tutor Rusticus, who handed him a copy of the lectures of Epictetus and essentially changed his life. Epictetus, whose lectures form the second major pillar of the book, had been born a slave. He studied philosophy with the permission of his owner, was eventually freed, and went on to become one of the most influential teachers of his generation, attracting wealthy students from across the Roman world to his school in Nicopolis, Greece. And Seneca, the third great voice of the Daily Stoic, was a playwright, statesman, and advisor to the Emperor Nero, one of the wealthiest men in Rome. A person whose life ended when Nero ordered his death, and he was forced to open his own veins. Three completely different lives. Three completely different positions in the social and political hierarchy, and remarkably convergent wisdom. This convergence is one of the most compelling arguments for Stoicism's validity. When the emperor and the slave and the condemned statesman are arriving at the same conclusions about how to live, when the same philosophy serves the most powerful man in the world and the man who owns nothing, not even his own body, you have to take seriously the possibility that there is something genuinely true being said. The core of Stoicism, the thing it keeps coming back to regardless of which philosopher is speaking or which century we're in, can be expressed in a handful of related ideas. Let's spend real time with each of them, because they form the conceptual foundation of everything in the book. Part 2. The dichotomy of control. The most important idea in Stoicism. Epictetus opens his handbook, the Enchiridion, with what may be the most foundational idea in the entire Stoic tradition. He says, essentially, that some things are in our power and some things are not. Things in our power include our judgments, our desires, our aversions, our responses. Things not in our power include our bodies, our reputations, our positions in society, the actions of other people, the outcomes of events. And the beginning of wisdom, he says, is learning to distinguish clearly between these two categories and investing our energy only in the first. Holiday calls this the dichotomy of control, and he returns to it throughout the entire year of the book. It is, in some ways, the master key that unlocks every other Stoic idea. Because virtually all human suffering, anxiety, resentment, grief, envy, frustration, arises from treating things in the second category as though they were in the first. We act as though we control our reputation and suffer when others think badly of us. We act as though we control our health and are devastated by illness. We act as though we control other people's choices and are continually disappointed. We act as though we control outcomes and are broken by results we didn't intend. The Stoic prescription is not to stop caring about these things entirely. It is to direct your effort and attention toward the things genuinely within your power, the quality of your intentions, the honesty of your character, the effort you bring to bear on a situation, and to hold everything else with a looseness that comes from genuinely understanding that it is not yours to control. Marcus Aurelius returns to this idea repeatedly in his meditations. What's inside me, he writes to himself, is mine. What's outside me, even my own body, even my own empire, is not fully mine. And the degree to which my inner life is clear, intentional, and virtuous is the degree to which I am genuinely free, regardless of what is happening around me. This was not abstract philosophy for Marcus. He was dealing, throughout his reign, with military campaigns, plagues, political betrayals, the deaths of children, the constant weight of governing a vast and restless empire. The Stoic framework was, for him, a daily practice of sanity in circumstances of extraordinary pressure. Epictetus, who had nothing, who had been owned as property, whose body was literally the possession of another person, found in this same idea the source of his freedom. No one, he taught, can take from you what is genuinely yours. They can take your property, your freedom of movement, your physical safety, but they cannot take your judgment. They cannot take your capacity to choose your response. They cannot take your integrity, your honesty, your willingness to be the person you have decided to be. These inner resources are inviolable. And if you understand that they are where all real value lies, then no external deprivation can destroy you. This is a powerful idea. It is also a demanding one. And it is the spine of the entire book. Part 3. The 3 disciplines: perception, action. And Will Holiday organizes the entire year around the 3 disciplines that the ancient Stoics, especially as systematized by the philosopher Epictetus, identified as the 3 arenas of human life, where Stoic practice is applied. The first discipline is perception, how you see and interpret what happens around you. The Stoics believed that it is not events themselves that trouble us, but our judgments about events. The same situation, a traffic jam, a critical comment from a colleague, a piece of bad news, produces wildly different emotional experiences in different people, not because the situation is different, but because the perception of it is different. The Stoic practice is to learn to see clearly and honestly, to strip away the automatic emotional layering we put on top of events, and to perceive what is actually there rather than what our fears and desires and habits of mind tell us is there. Marcus Aurelius has a practice he uses in his meditations that Holiday highlights repeatedly, something that modern philosophers have called objective representation. When something happens, instead of immediately engaging the emotional response, Marcus would try to describe the situation in purely physical, factual terms. Not "that person insulted me," which is already an interpretation containing a judgment, but "that person said these specific words." Not "I am being treated unjustly," which imports an entire framework of fairness, but "this is what happened." The emotional response may come anyway, but the pause to perceive clearly before reacting emotionally is the beginning of wisdom. Connected to this is the Stoic practice of negative visualization, the deliberate, regular contemplation of what you might lose. This sounds, at first, like a recipe for anxiety. It is actually the opposite. The Stoics observed that we spend enormous psychic energy in the unconscious assumption that the things we have and love will continue indefinitely. We treat the people in our lives, the health we currently enjoy, the freedoms we currently possess, as permanent features of our landscape. And this assumption, which is always false, produces a specific kind of suffering when things change, a suffering that is compounded by having never genuinely registered what we had while we had it. Negative visualization disrupts this. By deliberately imagining the loss of what you value, not as a morbid exercise but as a gratitude practice, you begin to experience your current circumstances with a clarity and appreciation that ordinary assumption denies. The meal you had tonight was genuinely good. The person sitting across from you is genuinely precious. This is what you have right now. It will not always be this. That recognition, held lightly and honestly, makes the present vivid in a way that taking it for granted never can. The second discipline is action, the way you engage with the world and with other people, and specifically the commitment to act virtuously for the benefit of both yourself and the broader community, regardless of whether the outcome is what you hoped for. This is where Stoicism gets genuinely demanding, because it asks you to uncouple the quality of your actions from the quality of your results. To do the right thing not because it will produce the right outcome. Outcomes are not always within your control, but because doing the right thing is its own justification. The Stoics held a concept they called preferred indifference, things like wealth, health, success, reputation that are natural to prefer and reasonable to pursue, but that are not the ultimate good. Virtue alone is the ultimate good. And the person who pursues wealth virtuously, with integrity and for good ends, is acting well regardless of whether they become wealthy. The outcome is preferred. The virtue is required. The third discipline is will, the ability to accept, with neither excessive grief nor hollow denial, the things you cannot change. The Stoics called this a more fatty love of fate. Not resigned tolerance of fate, not gritted teeth acceptance, but a genuine, practiced willingness to embrace what comes, not because what comes is always good, but because resistance to what cannot be changed is pure waste of the one resource that is genuinely yours, your inner life. Marcus Aurelius puts it in a way that has resonated across centuries. He says, essentially, that everything that happens according to nature, and that what happens according to nature cannot be wrong in the deepest sense, even if it is painful. The loss is real. The grief is appropriate. But fighting the fact of the loss, spending your energy raging against what has already occurred and cannot be undone, adds suffering without adding anything of value. The Stoic practice is to grieve what is genuinely worth grieving, and then to return to the work of living as well as you can. Part 4, January. The discipline of perception, clarity and seeing. What is real? Holiday begins the year with perception because the Stoics believed that everything begins with how you see. And the first lesson of January is about the examined life, the practice of looking at your own assumptions, your own reactions, your own habits of mind with the same honest scrutiny that you might apply to external problems. Epictetus's formulation, which Holiday returns to repeatedly, is that it is not things that disturb us, but our opinions of things. And this is a harder claim than it sounds. Most of us, most of the time, experience our emotional reactions as if they are the direct effect of events, as if the anger is caused by the thing that happened rather than by our judgment of the thing that happened. The Stoic discipline of perception begins with the practice of creating a pause between event and judgment, between stimulus and response, between what happened and what you decide it means. The January section introduces one of the most powerful Stoic perceptual tools, what Holiday calls the view from above. It comes from Marcus Aurelius, who regularly practiced imagining himself looking down at the world from a great height, seeing the movements of people, the flow of events, the vast sweep of time and geography as a way of putting his immediate concerns in proportion. What feels enormous and urgent from inside your own experience often looks very small from a sufficient distance. Not so small that it doesn't matter, but small enough that it can be held with some degree of equanimity rather than consuming everything. The clarity that the Stoics valued was not only perceptual but also verbal. They were deeply suspicious of the way language shapes thought, the way the words we use to describe situations carry emotional loading that distorts our perception of them. If I describe a colleague's criticism as an attack, I have already loaded the situation with a framework of hostility and threat. If I describe it as feedback, I have loaded it differently. The event is the same. The language shapes how I will experience and respond to it. The Stoic practice is to choose your language with deliberate accuracy, to describe what actually happened rather than the most emotionally charged interpretation of it. Part 5, February and March, Passions, Desires. And the unsteady mind. February in the Daily Stoic explores what the Stoics called the passions, emotions that they understood not as inherently problematic but as potentially destabilizing when they are not examined, and when they run the mind rather than the mind running them. The Stoics had a nuanced view of emotion that is often misunderstood. The popular image of a Stoic as someone who feels nothing, cold, detached, robotic, is not what they actually taught. The Stoics distinguished between pathological emotions, which are based on false judgments, believing that something outside your control is essential for your well-being, and what they called good emotional states, which are responses appropriate to what is actually happening. The sage may experience grief at genuine loss, joy at genuine good, and righteous anger at genuine injustice. What they will not experience or will work to minimize is anxiety about things that cannot be changed, rage at things that were always going to happen, or the crushing despair that comes from having built your entire sense of well-being on external conditions. Holiday spends February working through anger in particular, because the Stoics wrote about it extensively and because it remains one of the most universally corrosive emotional patterns in human life. Marcus Aurelius writes about anger with a specificity that is striking given his position. Here's the most powerful man in the world writing reminders to himself not to let the stupidity or bad behavior of others ruin his day. recognizing that anger at others generally harms the angry person more than its target. He has a formulation that Holiday highlights: what injures the hive injures the bee. We are all connected. The damage we do to our community through reactive anger and retaliatory behavior comes back to us. March turns to appetite and desire, the Stoic exploration of what we want and why we want it, and what happens to us when we get it. The Stoics were not ascetics in the strict sense. They didn't believe pleasure was evil or that physical comfort was something to be rejected entirely. But they were deeply suspicious of the way desire operates, the way it tells us that satisfaction lies just ahead, in the next acquisition or the next achievement, and then moves the goalposts the moment we arrive. Epictetus has a formulation that is both simple and difficult. Don't seek for everything to happen as you wish it would, but wish that everything happens as it actually does happen, and your life will be serene. This is the Stoic response to desire's insatiability. Not to stop wanting things, but to want what is alongside whatever you reasonably pursue. To practice a form of inner freedom that doesn't depend on outcomes aligning with preferences. Part 6. April. Unbiased thought and the examined judgments. April's theme is about the quality of your thinking, specifically the Stoic commitment to reason as the primary tool for navigating life, and the practices they developed for keeping reason clean and honest. The Stoics were deeply interested in what we would now call cognitive biases, the systematic ways in which human thinking goes wrong. They observed that we are prone to confirmation bias, to tribalism, to motivated reasoning, to the distortions of wishful thinking and fearful thinking. And they developed specific practices for countering these tendencies, practices that map remarkably well onto what modern cognitive science has independently discovered about how the mind works. One of the most important is what Marcus Aurelius called the practice of turning the obstacle upside down. He writes that when something appears to block his path, he asks not, "How do I get around this?" but, "How does this thing I was trying to avoid become exactly what I needed?" This is not wishful thinking or toxic positivity. It is a genuine practice of looking for the opportunity or the lesson embedded in adversity, not because adversity is secretly good, but because the energy spent fighting what cannot be changed is energy that could be spent finding what can be used. Holiday expanded this idea in his earlier book The Obstacle is the Way, which drew significant mainstream attention. The Daily Stoic develops it more fully in its daily context. Marcus Aurelius writes that the impediment to action advances action, that what blocks the way forward, when engaged with honestly, often becomes the way forward. The interpretation of events, the judgment you bring to what happens, shapes what you are able to do with it. And a mind trained to look for the useful rather than to lament the difficult is a mind that generates very different outcomes from the same circumstances. Part 7. May and June. The discipline of action. Doing your duty. May opens the book's second section, the discipline of action, and the dominant theme is duty. Not duty in the sense of grim obligation, but duty in the sense of the Stoic conviction that we are social creatures, embedded in communities and relationships and roles, and that a human life fully lived is one lived in service to those communities and roles with genuine engagement and genuine care. The Stoics had a concept they called sympathia, a deep interconnectedness of all things, all people, all life. The idea that we are not isolated individuals pursuing separate agendas, but nodes in a vast web of mutual dependency and influence. And from this view followed the ethical conviction that what benefits the whole benefits us, and what we do to harm others ultimately harms us. Not as a transactional calculation, not because good deeds are repaid with interest, but because the person who acts against the common good has corrupted something fundamental in themselves. Marcus Aurelius, who had more power than any individual alive, wrote to himself repeatedly about the obligation to use that power in service. Not for self-aggrandizement, not for personal glory, but for the well-being of the people in his care. Holiday highlights a passage in which Marcus notes that he rose in the morning not to enjoy the privileges of his position but to do the work of his position. That distinction between position as privilege and position as responsibility is one the Stoics made constantly and urgently. June focuses on problem-solving and pragmatism, the Stoic approach to navigating obstacles not through force of will alone but through clear-eyed assessment, patience, and the willingness to be flexible in method while firm in principle. The Stoics admired what they called practical wisdom, the ability to apply universal principles intelligently to specific circumstances. To know when the situation calls for action and when it calls for restraint, when to speak and when to remain silent, when to persist and when to let go. Seneca has a formulation here that Holiday uses effectively. There is a time for labor and a time for rest, a time for action and a time for reflection. The wise person learns to read which is which rather than applying one mode compulsively regardless of context. Relentless action without reflection is as foolish as endless reflection without action. The Stoic ideal is a person who can move fluidly between the two, guided by honest reading of what the moment requires. Part 8. July and August. Duty, Pragmatism, and the Work of Living. July's theme is duty in its most personal dimension, the specific obligations of your particular life, your particular roles, your particular relationships. And the Stoic challenge here is to take those obligations seriously enough to genuinely fulfill them, while holding them loosely enough that they don't become the source of resentment or identity-consuming anxiety. Holiday raises the concept of the task at hand repeatedly in July, drawing on Marcus Aurelius's practice of returning, again and again, to the immediate present, to the actual work in front of him, the actual person across from him, the actual decision that needs to be made today. Marcus had extraordinary breadth of responsibility and genuinely enormous pressures pulling his attention in every direction. His practice of returning to the immediate task, not the abstract future, not the weight of historical legacy, not the anxiety about what comes next, but this now. Here was a discipline he returned to daily. August focuses on pragmatism, the Stoic insistence that philosophy is for doing, not merely for discussing. Epictetus was famously impatient with students who could recite philosophical arguments, but didn't apply them in their own lives. He had a formulation that Holiday uses to excellent effect. Don't explain your philosophy. Embody it. The measure of your Stoic practice is not how well you can articulate the principles. It's how you behave when things go wrong, how you speak when you're angry, how you treat people who can't benefit you, how you face circumstances that frighten or threaten you. That's where the philosophy lives or doesn't. This is also where Holiday makes one of his most pointed observations about the relationship between philosophy and character. The Stoics taught that studying philosophy without living it was worse than not studying it at all, because it gave you the vocabulary of virtue without the substance, which produced the specific kind of corruption of someone who talks better than they live. Seneca, who was extraordinarily wealthy in a philosophy that questioned attachment to wealth, was painfully aware of this gap in himself, and wrote about it with a self-awareness that is one of the most humanizing features of his work. He knew he was not the sage he described. The practice was the attempt, imperfect and ongoing, to close the gap. Part 9. September. The Discipline of Will. Adversity and what it reveals. September opens the book's third and final section, the discipline of will, and it does so by sitting directly with difficulty. Holiday's claim, drawing on the Stoics, is that adversity is not something to be avoided or minimized as a primary goal, but rather one of the primary sites where character is formed and revealed. This is a position that requires careful handling because it can easily slide into a kind of philosophical victim-blaming or into a callousness about genuine suffering. Holiday and the Stoics he draws on are generally careful here, though not always. The argument is not that suffering is secretly good. It is that the response to suffering, the quality of mind and character you bring to difficulty, is where you have genuine agency. And that agency exercised well in hard circumstances is the highest form of the Stoic practice. The soldier, the athlete, the student, the parent, anyone who has undertaken something genuinely difficult and come through it, typically reports that the hard thing did something for them that the easy thing couldn't. Not because suffering is redemptive in some simple way, but because difficulty, engaged with honestly and with all of your resources, activates capacities that comfortable circumstances don't require and therefore don't develop. The Stoics called this process strengthening the ruling faculty, the rational, directing part of the mind that guides the rest. Marcus Aurelius wrote extensively about the fires in which character is tested. He used the image of a sword that is only made strong through the process of being heated and hammered, that the tempering process, which is violent and involves genuine force, is exactly what produces the qualities you value in the finished metal. The fire is not kind to the sword while it is happening, but without the fire, there is no sword. Part 10, October and November, Virtue, Relationships. And the common good October in the Daily Stoic is focused on the Stoic concept of virtue, which is the central concept of the entire philosophy, and which is worth understanding precisely because it is so frequently misunderstood. When the Stoics said that virtue is the only true good, the only thing that is good in itself, not merely instrumentally, they were making a claim that cuts against almost every other value system, ancient or modern. They were saying that health, wealth, pleasure, success, reputation, all the things that virtually every human being naturally wants, are not genuine goods in the fullest sense. They are preferred indifference, natural to want, reasonable to pursue, but not the source of eudaimonia, which is the word usually translated as happiness but which more precisely means something like flourishing or living well. Virtue, as the Stoics defined it, has four cardinal expressions: wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance. Wisdom is the ability to discern what is genuinely good and genuinely bad, to see clearly through the distortions of fear and desire and habit. Courage is the willingness to act on what you know to be right despite fear, discomfort, social pressure, and personal cost. Justice is the commitment to treating others rightly, not because it benefits you, but because it is right. And temperance is the self-discipline to restrain appetites and impulses that would otherwise lead you away from virtue. Holiday works through each of these in October, connecting them to specific modern situations with the clarity and practicality that characterizes the book at its best. He is particularly good on courage, specifically the kind of everyday moral courage that is rarely dramatic but constantly required. The courage to tell the truth when a lie would be easier. The courage to disagree with people whose approval you want. The courage to do the difficult work when avoidance is available. The courage to stay present in conversations you'd rather escape. The Stoics understood courage not primarily as physical bravery, but as integrity in action, the willingness to pay the price of being genuinely yourself. November's theme is relationships, and here the Stoics had both important things to say and a genuine tension with their own principles that Holiday navigates with varying degrees of success. The Stoics valued relationships and community deeply. Their concept of sympathia made human connection not merely nice but philosophically foundational. And yet they also taught a form of detachment that can, if misapplied, produce a coldness in relationships that defeats the very thing it was meant to protect. The key Stoic insight on relationships is this: love people without making your well-being dependent on them. Care for others without crossing the line into a need for them to be different than they are, to survive when they may not, to stay when they may go. The great Stoic teacher Epictetus had a formulation that Holiday presents with appropriate care. When you kiss your child, remind yourself that the child is mortal. This is not morbidity. This is the practice of loving with full awareness of what is true, that everything we love is temporary, that the people we cherish most are on loan from a universe that will eventually take them back, and that knowing this, deeply and honestly, is what allows us to love without the desperate clinging that turns love into anxiety. Part 11, December, Meditations on Mortality, and the Art of Living. The final month of the Daily Stoic is about death. Not as an ending, not as a horror to be avoided looking at, but as the philosophical key that unlocks everything else. The Stoics practiced what they called memento mori, remember that you will die, not as a morbid indulgence but as a clarifying discipline. Because the awareness of death, genuinely held and regularly revisited, has a specific and powerful effect on the quality of your presence in the life you currently have. Seneca wrote extensively about time, about how we squander it, how we pretend we have more than we do, how we defer living to some imagined future, in which conditions will finally be right. He observed that people spend enormous energy protecting their property, their reputation, their financial security, and almost no energy protecting their time, the one resource that, once spent, admits of no recovery whatsoever. No one gives away money as carelessly as they give away hours, he writes. And the poverty that results from wasted time is the most complete poverty there is, because time is the substance from which a life is made. Holiday uses December to bring together all three disciplines, perception, action, will, in the context of their ultimate destination. The discipline of perception says, see your life clearly, including its finitude. The discipline of action says, do what matters while you can. The discipline of will says, accept what comes with equanimity, including the final thing that comes to everyone. Together, these three say, live fully, now, in this impermanent and precious existence, without the paralysis of fear or the distraction of triviality or the wasteful luxury of procrastinated living. Marcus Aurelius has a formulation for this that Holiday returns to near the close of the book. He writes to himself that he should conduct himself in such a way that he would be comfortable if others could see everything he was doing. This is the Stoic version of integrity, not the performance of virtue for an audience, but the practice of virtue as if an audience were always watching, which is simply another way of saying, be the person you are trying to be, all the time, not only when it's easy or convenient or witnessed. The book ends where it began, with the observation that this is difficult, ongoing, never finished work. Marcus Aurelius never became the sage he described. Seneca never reconciled his wealth with his philosophy to his own satisfaction. Epictetus worked his entire life to embody what he taught, and always found places where he fell short. This is the human condition applied to the philosophical aspiration. The practice is the attempt. The attempt is the life. And the life, done honestly, is the best any of us can do. The critique, where the Daily Stoic earns genuine scrutiny now. Let's be honest. Because this book has real problems, and engaging with them carefully is a form of respect both for the reader and for the Stoic tradition itself, which, after all, valued honest, seeing above most other things. Let's start with what is probably the most fundamental critique, and one raised not just by armchair skeptics but by serious scholars of ancient philosophy. The Stoicism in the Daily Stoic is a selective and, in significant ways, distorted version of the original philosophy. And the distortions are not random. They consistently move the philosophy in a direction that is more palatable to modern, commercially oriented, success-focused Western readers, and in doing so, they remove precisely the elements of Stoicism that are most challenging and most transformative. Here is the clearest example. The original Stoics, Zeno, Chrysippus, the founders of the school, held a view of human beings and the cosmos that was deeply pantheistic and profoundly anti-individualist. They taught that the entire cosmos is a single living organism, that reason permeates all of it, and that individual human beings are infinitesimal fragments of this larger whole. The practical implication of this cosmology is not that you should use Stoic techniques to perform better at your job or achieve your goals or maintain your equanimity during difficult meetings. It is that you should understand yourself as fundamentally not the center of anything, that your individual desires, ambitions, and preferences are as cosmically trivial as a single cell's preferences are to the body that contains it. Holiday's version of Stoicism keeps the techniques, the dichotomy of control, the negative visualization, the practices of perception, while almost entirely discarding the cosmological framework that gave those techniques their specific meaning and their specific weight. What's left is a collection of very useful psychological practices, genuinely valuable habits of mind, and a set of principles that make for better behavior and clearer thinking. But it is not quite the full philosophy. It is the part of the philosophy that happens to be most compatible with a modern, individualistic, success-oriented worldview, extracted from a larger system that would actually challenge that worldview quite directly. Second critique. The book's handling of virtue, which the Stoics considered the only genuine good, the single thing worth pursuing, is significantly underdeveloped relative to its importance. Holiday does cover the 4 cardinal virtues across the year, particularly in October. But the cumulative impression of the Daily Stoic is that Stoicism is primarily a philosophy for achieving equanimity, resilience, and effectiveness, for not being thrown off by adversity, for keeping your head when circumstances are difficult, for performing at a high level under pressure. And this is certainly part of what Stoicism offers. But for the original Stoics, these capacities were not the point. They were byproducts of the actual point, which was virtue, which was becoming a person of genuine wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance, not as a means to success but as the definition of a good life, independent of any other outcomes. The difference matters practically. A Stoicism primarily aimed at equanimity and performance produces a very different person than a Stoicism primarily aimed at justice and genuine virtue. The first version might make a highly effective CEO. The second version might make a highly effective CEO who also gives away most of their money and refuses to act unjustly even when injustice would be profitable. The full Stoic tradition would recognize these as quite different outcomes. Holiday's version tends to flatten this distinction. Third, the book's format, 1 page per day, brief commentary, ancient quote, is its greatest accessibility feature and also its greatest limitation. There is something genuinely valuable about reading a single, carefully chosen thought and sitting with it for a day. This kind of slow, deliberate engagement with difficult ideas is exactly what sustained philosophical practice requires. But the format also prevents depth. A single page cannot explore a difficult idea with the nuance and rigor it deserves. And when the idea being compressed is 2,000 years of complex philosophical tradition, the compression necessarily flattens and simplifies. Some of the meditations in the book are genuinely illuminating. Others are superficial to the point of being misleading. And the reader who uses the Daily Stoic as their primary engagement with Stoicism will have a good but incomplete picture that can actually be a barrier to deeper understanding, the confidence of the partially informed. Holiday himself acknowledges this. He says explicitly, in the book and elsewhere, that the Daily Stoic is meant as an entry point, not a complete education. He recommends reading the original texts, Meditations, the Enchiridion, Seneca's letters, and this recommendation is genuine and important. But the problem is that most readers who find comfort and utility in the Daily Stoic will not go on to read the originals. The accessible version will substitute for the demanding version. And the demanding version is where the actual transformation is. Fourth, there is a specific kind of criticism leveled at Holiday's Stoicism that deserves careful attention rather than dismissal. Several critics have observed that Holiday's version of the philosophy functions, in practice, as a sophisticated justification for the status quo, a set of ideas that tells people in difficult circumstances to focus on their inner response rather than on changing the external conditions producing those circumstances. The dichotomy of control, taken to its logical extreme, could be used to counsel a person experiencing systemic discrimination to focus on their perception rather than on the injustice of their situation. The amor fati practice could be misapplied to tell people to love a fate that is the product of human injustice rather than natural inevitability. Now, to be fair to both Holiday and to the original Stoics, this is not what either actually teaches. The Stoics, including Marcus Aurelius, were clear that pursuing justice in the world is itself a Stoic virtue, that the discipline of action includes working to change what can be changed, and that injustice toward others demands response. Marcus Aurelius abolished some of the worst practices of gladiatorial combat. Cato spent his career opposing tyranny. Epictetus's entire teaching was shaped by his experience of slavery, and he understood injustice clearly. Stoicism is not pacifism. But the emphasis in Holiday's version of the philosophy falls so heavily on the internal, on perception, on the individual's response, on equanimity in adversity, that the active engagement with injustice that the original Stoics demanded gets significantly less airtime. And in a contemporary moment where questions of systemic injustice are live and urgent, a philosophy that is primarily about cultivating your inner state can become, if not carefully balanced, a form of sophisticated disengagement dressed in philosophical language. Fifth, the commercialization. And here is a critique that is simultaneously the most superficial and the hardest to entirely dismiss. Ryan Holiday has built a substantial commercial enterprise around Stoicism, books, a podcast, a daily email newsletter with hundreds of thousands of subscribers, merchandise including physical coins stamped with Stoic phrases, speaking engagements, a bookstore. There is nothing inherently wrong with any of this. Good ideas deserve wide distribution, and making ancient wisdom accessible to large audiences is a genuine good. But there is an irony that several critics have pointed to, and that Holiday himself is clearly aware of. The Stoics were deeply skeptical of commerce as a primary occupation, deeply suspicious of the accumulation of wealth and status as goals worth pursuing, and explicitly critical of the kind of fame and influence-seeking that a large media platform represents. Seneca's own wealth was a source of genuine philosophical anguish for him throughout his life. Cato refused luxury with almost theatrical severity. Epictetus owned almost nothing. And yet the modern face of Stoicism is a very successful author and entrepreneur with a large brand, selling commodified wisdom to an audience that is significantly drawn to that wisdom precisely because it promises to make them more effective and more successful in their professional lives. This is not a fatal contradiction. It is a tension. And the tradition of Stoicism itself, which valued the examined life above all, would demand that this tension be examined honestly rather than waved away. Holiday is not unaware of it, but the book doesn't engage with it directly. And readers deserve to notice it themselves. Sixth and final. The book's relationship with modern psychology. The Stoic practices Holiday describes, especially the dichotomy of control and the practice of objective representation, maps strikingly well onto cognitive behavioral therapy, acceptance and commitment therapy, and other evidence-based psychological approaches. Holiday acknowledges these connections, and they are genuine and significant. The overlap suggests that the Stoics were onto something real about human psychology that modern science has independently corroborated. But the overlap also creates a question the book doesn't fully answer. For someone dealing with genuine clinical anxiety, clinical depression, trauma, or serious mental health challenges, is the daily Stoic practice sufficient? And the honest answer is, probably not, and possibly not even helpful without professional support alongside it. The practices are real and valuable. But a daily philosophy text is not a substitute for clinical care when clinical care is what's needed. And the confident tone of the Daily Stoic, its manner of addressing the human condition as though the Stoic approach is the solution to the full range of human psychological difficulty, can mislead vulnerable readers into thinking they have a complete toolkit when they may need something more targeted, more clinically grounded, and more professionally supervised. None of these critiques mean the book isn't worth reading. It is. The selections are largely excellent. Hanselman's translations are genuinely useful, fresh, readable, precise. Holiday's commentary at its best is incisive and genuinely illuminating, particularly when he connects ancient thought to contemporary situations with real specificity. And the format, however limited in depth, has demonstrably changed the daily practice of hundreds of thousands of readers in ways that appear, by their own accounts, to have made their lives genuinely better. But read it knowing what it is and what it isn't. It is an excellent introduction to some of Stoicism's most useful ideas, delivered in an accessible format with intelligent modern commentary. It is not the full philosophy. It is not an academic study. It is not a substitute for reading the original texts, which remain, in their own difficulty and their own ambiguity and their own unresolved complexity, more transformative than any book of excerpts with commentary can quite be. Use it as a door, not a destination. Read it the way Marcus Aurelius read Epictetus, as a prompt to the kind of internal examination that the daily practice of living requires. And then, when the door has opened, walk through it and go deeper. The tradition that Holiday and Hanselman are pointing toward is vast and rich and demanding and beautiful. The Daily Stoic is a beginning. The rest is up to you. Final thoughts. What does it mean that this 2,000-year-old philosophy has become, in the 21st century, one of the most widely read approaches to personal development in the Western world? What does it tell us that the words of a Roman emperor writing to himself, a Greek slave teaching in exile, and a wealthy playwright composing letters to a friend are being read every morning by millions of people on their phones before they start their workdays? I think it tells us something important about what the modern world is missing. We live in a culture of extraordinary material abundance and extraordinary psychological difficulty. We have more comfort, more safety, more options, more information than any generation in human history. And we are, by most measures, more anxious, more distracted, more disconnected, more uncertain about how to live than most generations before us. The tools for managing the external world have never been more sophisticated. The tools for managing the internal world are not keeping pace. The Stoics had a word for what they were after: prohairesis. It means something like the will or the faculty of choice, the part of you that is genuinely and inviolably yours, that no circumstance can take, that no fortune can either give or remove. Strengthening this faculty, the part of you that chooses, that judges, that responds, was the entire project of Stoic philosophy. Not making the external world better, though that was also a Stoic obligation, but making the internal world stronger, clearer, more genuinely yours. The Daily Stoic, whatever its limitations and whatever its commercial trappings, is pointing toward that project. And the project is real. The emperor and the slave were both trying to do it, in their incomprehensibly different circumstances, with the same intellectual tools. The fact that those tools are still useful, that you can read a letter Seneca wrote to a friend about how to use your time, and feel the weight of it in your own day 2,000 years later, is either a testament to the universality of human nature or to the permanence of certain wisdom, or to both at once. Pick it up, read a page,
Sit with it.
and then go about the work of the day as well as you can manage, knowing that the attempt, imperfect, ongoing, never finished, is the point.